Today, most young people think of Dick Clark as the host of New Year's Rockin' Eve at Times Square in New York City. Others may remember that he had a successful television dance show, American Bandstand. Dick Clark started out at WFIL TV in Philadelphia, where he hosted Bandstand, a local dance party show. The show was so successful that it was picked up nationally by ABC and dubbed American Bandstand. Rock and roll hopefuls and giants alike came to Philadelphia to appear on the show. If Dick Clark played your songs, or better yet, allowed you to play live, you were almost guaranteed success. Clark hosted his way into America's heart as the handsome, upbeat young man who rubs shoulders with teens and rock stars alike. But there is a story from Clark's years at WFIL of a far different kind, a strange experience that he never forgot. One morning at the station, Dick saw a co-worker coming down the hall. He knew that the fellow had been terribly ill recently, so he was a bit surprised to see him back to work so soon. Dick stopped his co-worker and they spoke for a few minutes. He inquired about his health, and the co-worker said that he was okay, but not up to par yet. With that, Dick excused himself and moved on so he could prepare for his 3 p.m. show. A few nights later, Dick was at a party and happened to spot his co-worker's son among the throng. Dick made his way over to the young man and they chatted for a few moments. Dick mentioned that he had seen the young man's father at work only a few days earlier. The young man looked at Dick quite strangely. "When was this?" inquired the young man. Dick thought a moment and told him the exact day and time. The young man shook his head. "You must be mistaken. That was the day my father died. In fact, he was in the operating room at 11 a.m. and his heart stopped at just about that time." Dick didn't argue the point, but came away a bit shaken. He had no doubt that he had seen the man at 11 a.m. on the day he had apparently died. Had the man come to the office just one more time to check things out? Will we ever know? When the Cherry Street prison in Philadelphia was bursting with prisoners, the city fathers realized that they needed to build a new prison. At the time, prisons were places of punishment, where people were left to rot until their time was served. In 1787, Benjamin Franklin gathered the prominent men of Philadelphia together so that they could discuss the problem of the crowded prison. Dr. Benjamin Rush proposed a radical idea that prisons should be for more than punishment. Prisoners should reflect upon their crimes, spending their time in careful contemplation and reflection. This would allow them to develop regret and penitence in their souls. Rush proposed that a penitentiary would be a far better place, and that Pennsylvania could set the standard by designing such a facility. From that discussion came the genesis for Eastern State Penitentiary. 40 years later, this radical penal concept became the basis for a new penitentiary designed by architect John Haviland. Haviland designed a unique building that resembled a wagon wheel. The administration and the guards were located in the hub. 7 cell blocks radiate from the central core. It was a simple and effective design that allowed the guards to monitor the prisoners with the least amount of effort. Originally, the penitentiary was designed to hold 250 prisoners, but Haviland was prevailed upon to redesign the prison so that it would hold 450 inmates, both male and female. When Eastern State Penitentiary opened its doors in 1829, it was a marvel of modern engineering and the most expensive American building of its time. It had indoor flush toilets and running water in each cell. It was one of the first public buildings in the nation so equipped. Even the White House was not as well outfitted. The formidable medieval facade of Eastern State was built to intimidate. The cathedral-like atmosphere of the public part of the building is reminiscent of a monastery. But unlike a cloister, the cells were much more uncomfortable. The doors to the cells were so short that the inmates had to stoop and humble themselves in order to enter. Each cell held little besides a bed, a sink, and a commode. The only light came from a narrow skylight in the ceiling that was referred to as the Eye of God, because one had to look upward to see light. The only book allowed in the cell was the Bible. Prisoners faced a bleak existence when they entered the penitentiary. They were taken to a room and stripped. Their bodies were examined, and every mole, birthmark, and scar was recorded in a book under their names. Their feet were measured, and they were given a test to see if they could read. Then they were given a number. From that time on, it was how they would be identified. The prisoners were instructed that quiet was to be observed at all times. Hoods were placed over the prisoners' heads, and they were led down the corridor to their cells. They were taken inside and would remain there except for illness or discipline until their sentence was up. They would eat and sleep in the cell. They were occasionally taken out for exercise in hooded silence. It was a world of sensory deprivation that drove many people mad. The prisoners could not sing, talk to themselves, or make any sound. The guards even wore socks over their shoes to quiet their footfalls. It became a silent hall of torture. For those who acted out, punishments awaited. Some punishments were adapted from those used in mental hospitals of the time, while others originated within the prison walls. Prisoners were sent to the hole for acting out. The hole was actually one of 2 cells, where the inmates were often stripped and forced to lay on the floor to rest. They had no blankets or any amenities. The prisoners, often sentenced to bread and water, or a half ration of bread and water could be left there for days or even months. One prison guard reportedly offered water to a prisoner who was on the verge of mental and physical collapse after he had spent more than 2 months in the hole. The guard was fired for his compassion. The mad chair was another popular form of punishment. Prisoners with restraints on their hands and legs were strapped to the chair so tightly that they lost circulation in their limbs, and on occasion, a person's limbs would turn black. Even when prisoners were released, their excruciating pain continued, and some were even crippled. The use of a straitjacket was also common. A person could be bound so tightly that it might cut off circulation to the point that the person would be rendered unconscious. Water baths were often used in mental hospitals as a form of shock treatment. A person would be stripped and placed in a bath of ice-cold water. Eastern State Penitentiary had its own version. They would chain people to a wall and douse them with ice water. In the summer, this was bad enough, but imagine being chained to a wall outside in the winter and being left dripping wet for hours on end. The guards would often douse prisoners several times with icy water and let them freeze. The damage done by frostbite was terrible to behold. Years later, the water treatment would be modified, and prisoners would be hosed down with high-pressure hoses while they were chained up. By far, the most feared torture was the iron tongue gag. The iron tongue gag was a 5-inch long piece of metal that was clamped down over the prisoner's tongue. It was connected to chains on the prisoner's wrist. If the prisoner moved even slightly, the ruthless tongue gag gouged and mangled his tongue. At least one person died from the tongue gag. Charles Dickens was a great believer in the reformation of the prison system. He had been in a debtor's prison as a child and had seen firsthand the cruelty at work within such facilities. When Dickens made his American tour in 1842, he made a stop at Eastern State Penitentiary. After examining the facility and speaking with selected prisoners, Dickens wrote scathingly about conditions at the prison. He would be only one of many critics of the penitentiary system and of Eastern State. During the Industrial Revolution, the rules changed for the inmates of the Eastern State Penitentiary. The prison warden realized that he had a cheap labor pool, and so the prisoners went to work. The rule prohibiting speaking was lifted, but only if the prisoners were speaking about work. Later, the rule was removed altogether. In 1929, the Chicago mobster Al Capone was arrested in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon. Capone's arrest came only months after the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago that he had ordered. The killings, a clever attempt to take out George Bugs Moran, a competitor of Capone's, failed, and Capone's men only succeeded in killing 7 of Moran's men, including his brother-in-law, James "Jimmy" Clark. Capone received a bit of special treatment during his year at the penitentiary. He was given a large room, which he furnished with antiques, rugs, and oil paintings, and he was allowed to conduct some business while incarcerated there. But Capone didn't rest easy at the prison. He claimed that he was being haunted by the specter of Jimmy Clark. On many occasions, the guards would hear Capone crying out that Jimmy was in his cell. He claimed that Jimmy haunted him, and he continued to make this claim until his death years later. Capone was suffering from the beginning effects of an untreated case of syphilis at the time, which could explain his hallucinations. But others claimed that they experienced the same haunting through the years. Capone's own valet and guards also reportedly saw and heard Jimmy. Years later, guards at Alcatraz prison in San Francisco would also claim to have had experiences in and around Capone's cell with the ghostly Jimmy. In 1971, Eastern State Penitentiary closed its doors. The prison that had changed the world was no more. Eventually, the Pennsylvania Prison Society took over the building and began to offer tours. It was then that the ghostly tales of Eastern State Penitentiary began to come to light. Today, a non-profit corporation, Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site, operates the prison and offers tours, including a popular haunted house. The men and women housed at Eastern State Penitentiary became shadows of their former selves locked behind those silent doors. Perhaps that is why the ghosts who linger there only reveal themselves as shadows flitting by. Most hauntings have faces or names, but not at Eastern State Penitentiary. Cell Block 6 and the other older cell blocks are known to be among the most haunted parts of the prison. In these blocks, people repeatedly report seeing shadowy people moving down the hallways and inside the cells. In cell block 12, crazy laughter is heard as if a madman is housed there. Death Row was the cell block where those facing death, with the electric chair Old Sparky, were housed. People have reported seeing a black figure there running down the aisle and darting from cell to cell. Some people claim that when they walk through this cell block they hear voices whispering, even though they are totally alone. In the 1990s, a locksmith named Gary Johnson was in the older section of the prison working on a rusted cell door lock. He was feeling very uncomfortable, as if he were being watched. Repeatedly, Johnson looked up expecting to see someone, but found himself alone. Finally, he glanced up again and saw a black shadow jump across the hallway toward him. Johnson beat a hasty retreat. The most uncomfortable hauntings seem to be in the infirmary. There people find themselves shaken and frightened without reason. Others hear voices crying out in pain and the sound of sobbing. In this area, voices have been recorded on numerous occasions. The Central Guard Tower is also said to be the home of a ghostly guard. This man has been seen up in the tower walking his eternal watch. When the staff investigates, they find no one in the guard tower. Eastern State Penitentiary seems to be a place haunted by shadows and furtive ghosts. It seems to have been taken over by the spirits of the inmates and by at least one lonely guard who stands watch. Eastern State Penitentiary is perhaps one of Pennsylvania's most haunted places.